Keith, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, George, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
We're going to talk about some serious topics, but to start things off on maybe a somewhat lighter note, thinking back to when you were at DocuSign starting in 2009, did you ever think that in 2022 we would still have fax machines? That they'd still be hanging on here for the last drop of blood?
Well, I thought those would be gone by now, but I also, I didn't. A lot of people said that DocuSign would just be a feature of Adobe, but I looked at that as an opportunity because I knew we could run the same play that we ran, at Ariba, and now, there's 1 billion users around the world with DocuSign.
That's fantastic. And you talk about running the same play. If I look back at your career, you're such an amazing change agent and a catalyst from GM to Ariba to DocuSign to the Department of State. And, you're the change guy. But what I find amusing as you look back at all that is there's so much, at least it looks like there's a lot of consistency in your values, consistency in the playbook, and this focus on trust and vigilance and highly performing teams. And I feel like that's just important as a human. And I'm curious where those roots were. Does that go back to working in your dad's machine shop? Where did you build all that?
Yeah, it totally goes back to, my dad had a 5-person machine shop. In the good times and the tough times, it was just me and him. It was right in small town Ohio. Our customers were the big three. And, I was welding at the age of 12. And I learned those great Midwestern values, obviously from my dad, and a work ethic and a great sense of humor. I remember, we would go in on Saturdays and we'd scrub the toilets. And I remember him yelling across the stall, the other one, and I hated it. And he just goes, "Keith, we can't solve world peace, but we can try." That was the kind of things. I get paid 50 cents an hour. He'd slap me on the back, and a 10-hour shift, 90 degrees. And he'd go, "Keith, we don't make a lot of money, but we sure have a lot of fun, don't we?" So, you learn that stuff.
That's important. That's so important. And now you've co-created the Kroc Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue. I know recently the Department of Commerce Secretary Raimondo, she was out there and she gave you kudos, saying that what you're doing with the Clean Network Initiative is brilliant. And I don't care how successful you are, it's nice to hear those kudos, not just for yourself, but for your team. I'm curious if you could expand a little bit on why did you co-found this? What's the mission? What are you guys trying to do there? Oh, which, by the way, before you do, what I love about it is that it's nonpartisan, and what I love about it is that it's not just about ideas. You seem to be showing people how to get stuff done, which is just killer.
Absolutely. And, the first thing I want to say is it's always a team effort, right? I've made a living surrounding myself by people who are smarter than me. And so the Kroc Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue it's rapidly becoming the preeminent global authority on tech diplomacy and a thing called tech statecraft, which integrates high-tech business strategies with foreign policy tools based upon this doctrine we created at the State Department called the Trust Doctrine. But the premise of the Institute, it's founded on technology must advance freedom. And technology can be used for good purposes. It can be used for evil purposes. And so it's really designed to advance freedom by combating authoritarian regimes like China and Russia.
It's interesting. Freedom, when we think about trust, you really have the most freedom when you're within that circle of trust, right? When you have those norms and everything nailed down for trust. And I'm curious, how have you used that concept of trust, within this institute and within your career, and how do you accelerate it?
Sure. Trust has been at the forefront of every company I've built. Was the forefront of defeating the Chinese Communist Party's master plan to control the 5G. I really believe that trust is the most important word in any language. You do business with people you trust. You partner with people you trust. You buy from people you trust. You love people you trust. And you know, at DocuSign, I used to stand up on stage and I would say, look, guys, we're not in the software business. We are in the trust business. We deal with people's most important documents. Those are the ones that you sign. And so we utilized that concept at the State Department when it looked like the Chinese Communist Party, their most important company, their backbone for their surveillance state, their national champion, Huawei, and 5G was going to run the table all over the world. And that means that they cannot just control cell phones, but also power grids, sanitation systems, Internet of Things, manufacturing processes, autonomous vehicles, you name it. And basically we use that trust doctrine to defeat them. And if there's anything that's a trust business, it's 5G. And you know, one of the interesting things when I was at the State Department, George, was in my first 60 bilaterals with foreign ministers or economic ministers or finance ministers, I'd ask them, I'd say, hey, how's your relationship with China? And they would go, well, they're really important. They're an important trading partner. And then it seemed almost every time they looked both ways, like somebody was in the room, and they go, but we don't trust them. And that's what rang bells in my head. So if you think about the principles that protect our freedoms, they are things like transparency, reciprocity, respect for rule of law, respect for property of all kinds, respect for human rights, respect for the environment, respect for sovereignty of nations, respect for the press, you know, accountability, integrity, and all of those equal trust. And what we found, George, was that in the China and Russia have been using those principles against us. And so what we did is in one jiu-jitsu move, we flipped them on their back and used it against them. In essence, we weaponized the very principles that protect our freedoms, and that all adds up to trust.
That's tremendous. You know, I feel like too many times you hear the phrase trust takes time, and I feel like that gets translated into that's all trust needs is time, and it's not true. You need the clarity, which it seems like you've done a great job of outlining. What does trust mean for us? It needs the accountability, and it needs the intentions put forth on that trust to actually make it happen. You know, when I was digging deep on what you did with the Clear Network Alliance, I found a sentence that I'll read it here because it made me laugh out loud, but I was because I was impressed. But it said Kroc wanted to be able to move fast, and so we needed to align the multiple agencies and departments within the U.S. government around a competitive U.S. technology strategy. And I laughed because I was like, how the hell are you going to do that fast? And then you managed to do it in 9 months. So, you know, I'm curious to hear about that. You know, how do you get people bought in, and how do you push away the naysayers and then actually get something done like that?
Yeah, you know, it's really a great question because, you know, we know in the business world, the ultimate strategic weapon is speed. And when you're disrupting an industry, you're creating a category. It's not the big that's going to eat the small. It's the fast that's going to eat the slow. And so you go into government that not typically goes fast. How did we do that? Well, one of the things we did is we had a strategic plan. We had a playbook. We got our teams totally aligned. I brought in 12 results-oriented executives and entrepreneurs and technologists from Silicon Valley. I also brought in the Dean of Engineering at Purdue, who's just been named the next president, to work on our team. And, you know, we knew how to move fast. And so to get that buy-in, and we had great clarity. And, you know, what's amazing in the United States government, if you're getting results, then everybody's just going to jump on board, and that's exactly what we did.
What I also liked in your approach was you recognized that when we think about bureaucracy and policy, that they were using too many sticks and not enough carrots, and that you needed to look at these organizations like the consumer. So you were really bringing what you learned from the private sector into the public sector. And what was that shift like to start using more carrots?
George, it's really a good point because what was interesting for me is that these things we use in Silicon Valley, if you call it practicing economic warcraft, because it's all about being the category king, because category king gets 80% of the market cap, made 80% of the market resources. Players 2, 3, 4, 5, they got to fight over the scraps. It just so happens when we play economic warfare out here in Silicon Valley, you have to play by the rules, because if you don't have your integrity, you're not going to last very long. Now, in the State Department, what we learned, it's like superpowers. So I'll give you an example. So all previous efforts, government efforts, had failed in terms of stopping Huawei. They had all the momentum. And as we know, in a rapidly changing market, everybody wants to go with the leader, and leadership is not defined by size. It's defined by momentum. So our strategic imperative was to reverse their momentum and replace it with ours. And so what was happening is the previous efforts, it was kind of, I'll be honest, it was like the ugly American going around pounding tables around the world, prime minister saying, don't buy Huawei. And I said, hey, you know what? Why don't we do something different? Why don't we treat these countries and these telecommunication firms like customers? And the customer's always right. Nobody likes to be told what to do. So you need a value proposition if you expect somebody to partner with you. So we created, a 7-step value proposition as we would go around and talk to these countries and telcos. And to me, it just seemed like common sense. But for a lot of people in government and at the State Department, they said, wow, how'd you think of that? It's just instinct.
That's funny. I feel like I use the same approach with my 5-year-old daughter. You can't just demand that they do what you say. You kind of have to have those sticks, or the carrots, right, and really treat them like the customer.
I've got 11-year-old twins. I hear you, George. Totally.
So now I'll bounce around your career a little bit to kind of take it from different points. So because you use the same playbook at most of your organizations, and what I'm curious about is I'm curious if this was style difference or if it was on purpose. It was this inverted pyramid from vision down to an execution, with execution being the small one. But then for your clean networks, it was upside down, with the execution being much, much bigger. Was that on purpose, or is that just a style difference of your playbook?
Well, so I've used that same playbook of, and you're right, it's shaped like a pyramid: vision, mission, values, team rules, long-term goals, strategy, all boiled down to execution. I've used that in 10 companies ever since I was at General Motors, since I was a VP there, and when we created, GMF Robotics, which is now the largest manufacturer of industrial robots, all the way through RAS and computer software. I used it when I was chairman of the board of Purdue, and of course, Ariba, DocuSign, all that. And so sometimes I change the color or invert it, just for a little change,
a little flavor, but you're consistent still.
But what's funny is, like, I've got a bunch of guys who've worked with me, across multiple, companies. I brought a lot of them to the State Department, and one guy, Mark Carlson, who's been with me from General Motors at everything I've done, he just goes, all right, Kroc, just add water, stir, here we go, playbook, run the play. And it works. And you tweak it over time in terms of different nuances, but the basic framework works.
That's fantastic. And let's focus in on Ariba, because you're part of that co-founding team. This is a blank canvas. It's a really new market completely. You're in the kind of a middle. You've got your belt under your legs under you from GM and starting another company. How much of your kind of leadership principles and everything were already formed in Rock versus are you now learning on the job, figuring things out as you go?
Well, I think the way I look at it is, I've always jumped in water over my head, so to speak. And that's how you learn the most, by getting bloodied in the battle. So I think the way to look at it is my transformational journey has been high velocity, and you make a lot of mistakes along the way too, and that's when you learn the most. And by the way, when you're jumping water over your head, that's an adrenaline rush. And it almost after a while becomes addicting. So I think that's one of the first steps to becoming a transformational leader. So, add it up all along the way. But it really does. A lot goes back to when I was at Purdue. A lot of things I learned in leadership positions in the Sigma Chi fraternity. And then, when I'm a VP at General Motors at 26, you talk about jumping water over your head. So you just keep adding those different plays, and you're learning all along. The other important thing too is, my mom would always say, the best way to learn is from your mistakes, and the best way to learn that is OPE, other people's experience. She said, so I've always been blessed with great mentors, and I'm a big believer in mentorship. That's one of the reasons why I created this company called the Global Mentor Network. And, my mom said, you'll have time enough to make mistakes on your own. So I think it's a combination of mentoring, jumping in water over your head, and those kind of things, and just being curious, I think.
That makes a lot of sense. I love nothing more than sharing the many mistakes that I've made with others so that they can learn from them. It's a real pleasure, right?
Yeah, and you know what? When you're mentoring somebody, the most important thing is to talk about your fears, your failures, and your flaws. That's what mentees want to know. And so that's really important. And by the way, also, I always say the most non-intuitive advice I always give young fathers is talk about your mistakes, because that takes the pressure off these young guys, and they're going to have a lot of it. It also teaches them to take risks, and it's okay to fail.
I'll write that one down. My wife is going to like that. I tend to think that I'm just always right and always perfect, Keith. So, when you moved over to state, from the outside, I would think that that's a big shift in a lot of aspects of your career and your life. What was that change like, and what lessons did you learn from moving to the Department of State?
Well, first of all, I've had the blessing of living the all-American dream, growing up in small-town Ohio and all that. So to have the opportunity to give back to our great nation was really a great honor, and something I couldn't pass up in terms of running U.S. economic diplomacy. One of the things that really struck my curiosity was, are these same principles that worked in the business world, that worked in the nonprofit world, that worked in higher education, that were so successful in doing a lot of transformations, would that work in government? And what I found out, the same principles apply. As a matter of fact, they're superpowers. It all starts with building a high-performance team. And, one of the things that I've learned in my career is that diversity of thought and having a team of different temperaments, talents, and convictions is the catalyst for genius. So when I brought these 12 guys from Silicon Valley and combined them with these amazing career foreign service officers in civil service who can speak 4 to 7 languages, work their tail off, their North Stars, national security, it was like magic. It was like a 60-60 deal. And so that was an amazing experience. And that is also why I'm such a big pusher, that my advice to young people is go take a stint in government. And by the way, we need more people from the private sector. And when I mean private sector, I don't mean lawyers, politicians, not even bankers. I call those guys wealth transfer guys. What we need is wealth creation people, people who manufacturing or high tech, because what's going on, it's all about economic statecraft these days and tech statecraft.
Yeah, there's more operators that can get things
more
done,
operators,
right?
yeah. And you're absolutely right, George, because that was the other thing. What I saw clearly is there's a tremendous gap between policy and execution. And as we know, You can have the greatest policy or the greatest strategy in the world, but if you can't execute, you're going to lose every time. You can have an okay policy, okay strategy, but if you can out-execute everybody else, you're going to win every time.
Yeah. Yeah, the dirty secret among strategists is that strategy part's actually kind of easy. It's all the rest of the stuff it's hard to get done.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, you've been tasked to chair the Global Tech Security Commission at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. What's that all about? That sounds important, and I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, this is a tremendous and unique. It has the backing of the White House, both sides of the aisle. And so, think of the 9/11 Commission, how big that is. It's a 2-year commission. But what makes it different is it's an international commission. So we'll have commissioners from 15 different countries. We'll also have commissioners representing 15 of the most strategic national security tech sectors. And so the mission is to develop the global tech security strategy for the free world, and also to develop offensive and defensive strategies in each one of those tech sectors to advance freedom and combat techno-authoritarianism. So it's really very much a continue of that mission that we were on at the State Department. And, being able to put something like this together, it's really tough for a government to do. So having it private sector led, I think, is going to actually allow us to move really fast. And we're putting together a dream team of commissioners. And each one of those commissioners, there'll be 27 commissioners. And each one of those commissioners will build their own advisory council of 10 to 15 experts in either that country or in that specific tech sector. So at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're creating a movement to advance freedom through the adoption of trusted technology.
Given these roles that you're playing, you must just pontificate and think about the moment in time that we're at right now, right? Some people will label it the fourth industrial revolution. Whether you want to label it that or not, it seems that we're in this great moment of change. And if we don't address it the right way, we can end up in a bad spot. How do you think about this moment in time?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because after a while, your pattern recognition just kicks in. Like back in the early 80s when we started GMF Robotics, that was a whole technology paradigm shift. They had this thing called NC controllers. When we started RAS, the computer-aided engineering, it was workstations. Ariba, we were the first enterprise application to be written on the internet. That was another way. DocuSign, it was, all of a sudden now you got cloud and mobile. And now I look at this paradigm shift right now, and I see this wave coming. And this wave where citizens are waking up to China's authoritarian regime and their doctrine of retaliation, intimidation, coercion. And this is a huge paradigm shift. And I can tell you what, they have no respect for human life, for human rights, for the environment, for sovereignty of nations, for rule of law. And they want to spread their techno-authoritarianism, and you can see it. And by the way, TikTok is one of the ways that they do that. There's a lot of other ways, but so the way I look at it is this is that inflection point that we have to step up and do something. Because if there's anything I learned at the State Department, I grew up that white picket fence, that dog, those 3 children, and everything was Jim Dandy. But, this democracy, this 200-year plus experiment that we're living in, it's only an experiment, and the natural order of things is the bad king, the dictator, and the emperor. That's the laws of physics, and you have to fight every day to keep those freedoms. And the other thing something I really saw is that if it wasn't for the United States, there'd be 100 countries that wouldn't even taste freedom. So now we've got a big threat upon us. And the Chinese Communist Party represents a real and urgent threat to democracies around the world because they're dictating a dictator out of the box with their technology, surveillance tools, and their money.
Those are great points, and it doesn't come for free. And it really, democracy only really works the more that we all participate in it.
Yes.
So, as we think about those C-level executives that are out there, I have the pleasure of working with them at both enterprise and mid-market, and I know they're already being vigilant about so many things. They're trying to maintain their culture. They're trying to stay the market leader, maintain margin, cash flow. What responsibility do these business owners and C-level executives have, and what can they be doing to help, preserve this trust and our IP and innovation, all of it?
Yeah, they can do a lot. And by the way, I had really great experience with all kinds of CEOs of the State Department, particularly during COVID, like when we were repatriating citizens all over the world. And I was calling up, the CEOs of Delta and United and UPS and FedEx, and they were helping us get PPE and everything. But they can do a lot. And, the first thing that I want to, the message I would give to CEOs is what I'm seeing out there. And that is this, that some of the most prominent board members are demanding from their CEOs a China contingency plan, because what they've seen is they saw what happened with Putin's bloody invasion in Russia, and 300 of the top global companies had to pull out, all the way, lost hundreds of billions of dollars, and they had no plan on the shelf how to do this. And now they look at China and his clampdown on the private sector, extreme lockdowns of 500 million people on COVID over there, his aggression with Taiwan, the real estate market collapsing, him getting unlimited power, the potential for him to nationalize American companies over there. And, this is an inflection point. And so these CEOs have to have a China contingency plan, because the boards, our fiduciary duty to our shareholders is to mitigate risk. So we have on the shelf, a plan if there's a cyber breach. Well, this is a big risk, and you've got to have a plan. So I'm seeing these guys demand it. And so then what the CEO does is he'll go to his executive VPs. He'll go to his EVP of supply chain, sales, finance, and they'll each kind of prepare a chapter, in this China contingency plan. And then when it gets presented, to the board, it's not like something a board, they don't vote on it like an annual shareholder. They just kind of nod their head. So in other words, it's blessed. And then the smart CEO begins the implementation, because, and I penned an article in Fortune about this, and the way I ended it, I said, look, when the dreaded becomes the inevitable, it's time to develop a plan and execute on it. So this is key. And one of the things that's happening at the Kroc Institute is we're getting a lot of requests. What does a China contingency plan look like? Do you have a checklist? So we're putting together something for boards and for CEOs and outlining the checklist to follow, because there's a lot of nuances in that. You don't want to miss, one of the key prongs.
Yeah, the easier you can make it for them, the better, right? And as a consultant, I love playbooks and checklists. What I find interesting is amongst many of our other episodes, there's a common theme of how important resiliency is in your strategy, how important sustainability is. And if you're going to address those, there's no way you're going to avoid the China contingency, based off of everything I'm hearing from you.
You have to. And I'll tell you what CEOs can really do to help is, first of all, pull your supply chains out of China, because they're at risk. They really are. And make sure that you've got alternative places. The other thing is, I really talk a lot about this in terms of the average American citizen, and also a lot of companies don't realize that they're financing China's surveillance state that enables what many countries, including our own, call genocide, and what the United Nations calls crimes against humanity. And so these boards have a moral responsibility and a fiduciary duty to divest from these Chinese companies that are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So that's That's an important factor, number one. The other thing is to implement security safeguards for intellectual property theft. I mean, I had that experience at Ariba. Alibaba took a lot of our intellectual property. And by the way, I remember going over to China a few years later, and I said, hey, when are you guys going to stop stealing our technology? And they just kind of laughed and chuckled. They said, look, we don't really have a word for like stealing in Chinese. If it's there, you just take it. Goes, it's your guys' fault and problem. You're not protecting your intellectual property. And China does it a lot of different ways, a lot of technology transfer. And by the way, if you're going to build a plant in China, you're not just handing them the blueprints. You're teaching them the process engineering. You're training the workforce, and they're going to come back and compete against you. And so many companies have made that mistake.
You're just building your own innovator's dilemma for yourself by embedding over there. So Keith, you're making a lot of sense. We're coming up on our time. One question I love to finish with is,
Sure.
throughout your life, from your dad's machine shop to where you are now as a father, as a leader, what's the best advice you've ever received?
Well, I'll tell you. I remember when I came back for Thanksgiving, and I'm drinking beers with my dad. I came back from Purdue. I'm like 21 years old or whatever. And he goes to me, Keith, you ever feel like you're in a jam you can't get out of? Like you're getting, you ever get that feeling? I go, what do you mean, Dad? He goes, and he was a boxer in the Army. He goes, like you're getting pummeled in the ring and you can't get out. I go, oh, yeah, that warm feeling. He goes, there's only one way. He goes, there's one way to get out of it. It works every time. I go, what's that? He goes, mock yourself out. Now, he didn't use big words like self-deprecating humor or anything like that. It came from Germany. He said, mock yourself out. It works every time. He goes, just do it. I'm like, oh, okay. And then I remember walking up the stairs. It's late night. He puts his arm around me and he goes, and don't mock out other people. He goes, that hurts their feelings. And it's not funny. I think that, and so I think a sense of humor is a superpower too, and a self-deprecating one, because a way to build trust is to talk about your fears, your failures, and your flaws, because you make yourself vulnerable. And when you make yourself vulnerable, I'll tell you, about 95% of the time, people reciprocate in kind, and that causes a connection. So, if your most strategic asset in the business world or any diplomatic world is trusted relationships, and everything is divided by time, your ability to build trust quickly is a key skill.
That's huge, and it sounds like a great relationship with your father. Keith, thanks so much for everything you've done, for your service. Thanks for sharing your wisdom here. Really appreciate having you here.
You got it. All the best to you, George, and thanks so much.